Okay, the title of this is called Rethinking Psychosis. We are only just beginning to think about our thinking on psychosis. We do not understand the phenomenon sufficiently, let alone how it is caused. This very discourse, which is socially conditioned, presumes that psychosis is some sort of determined thing, something that is substantive and real, something medically objectified and classified, and that it has a biological basis or a genetic etiology. But those in clinical practice encounter different realities than those in the research lab. Psychosis never appears the same way. Why would we assume it has the same underlying mechanisms, let alone cause? Why would we lump human beings together into a socially constructed and contrived category? I must admit that I am uncomfortable even referring to a class of patients as psychotic, as I feel this is disrespectful and displaces a person's human dignity, although I understand we are cognitively disposed toward classifying phenomenon, and as professionals we must hold a common language for communicating shared meaning. I suppose this label is due in part to the historical aftermath of the simple binary invented between neurotic and psychotic to distinguish both, one, a form of psychic structure, and two, a level of severity in clinical presentation. Perhaps this gives us more of a clue as to why we invent these binaries to begin with. Difference and differentiation underlie all classifications. Mind is oriented toward differentiation, splitting, and bifurcation. And because of this cognitive propensity, humanity is compelled to see the world of phenomenon in such fragmented fashions. But if things are divided, hence separated and splintered off from one another, does this not speak to the primordial nature of mind, revealing itself through a simple economy? We often hear of schizophrenia as being a divided self, but don't all human beings have a divided mind? In fact, numerous divides? How do we make value distinctions of this sort when splitting and division are behind the structural processes of thought? We should never assume that the label psychosis, derived from the ancient Greek, which literally means animation, or of giving life to, applies to a mere anomalous subgroup of psychiatric patients. It does not, for it applies to us all. It is only in modern times that psychosis came to signify mental derangement. And even here, we must admit that we have no professional consensus on what constitutes derangement based on the cultural and linguistic relativity of definitions of normativity and abnormality. May I suggest that we do not truly understand the mechanisms of psychosis, nor what is truly its cause, let alone how to treat it optimally. I suppose using brain language promulgated by cognitive neuroscience and genetic biology is enough to satisfy the medical profession, and certainly the pharmaceutical industry, but it has limited therapeutic currency and crippling theoretical shortcomings that are barely addressed by the multidisciplinary field of mental health. And any discussion of personality structure, the attachment system, desire and defense, developmental trauma, interpersonal matrices, the social link, and the psychological needs and conflicts informing mental functioning are eclipsed for reductive explanations fixated on the neurobiology of thought disorder. Unfortunately, this form of medicalization of the human being fails to adequately understand the intrapsychic and intersubjective complexities of psychotic states, nor does it address the real needs of patients. Here I wish to revisit what we mean by psychosis, including examining its essential structure, and argue that it forms a core in normative human thought and mental functioning. but with the following caveat. It manifests on a spectrum of clinical symptomatology and dysfunction. Let us begin with a few speculative queries. Is psychosis a normative and universal feature of the psyche? Does it have a developmental correlate beginning in infancy that becomes suffused in the structuralization process inherent in personality formation? These are not idle questions, for this would mean that psychosis is a necessary aspect of psychic organization. In other words, it is not merely accidental, acquired, or contingent upon extrinsic conditions or cultural environs, but rather it would be psychogenetically determined a priori. Psychoanalysis has traditionally assumed that a psychotic core lies at the heart of psychic organization, inherent in both normativity and madness. We may historically observe how this assumption was posited by Freud and solidified in classical theory, beginning with the primacy of unconscious fantasy and hallucinatory wish fulfillment in early infancy, only to be radically developed by the Kleinian school in postulating an early developmental model that places psychotic process at the fount of psychic structure. Here the infant is believed to be besieged by persecutory and fearful anxieties and destructive impulses that have been split off, projected, and reintrojected back into psychic structure, characteristic of the paranoid schizoid processes. This assumption further led developmental theorists to consider rudimentary solipsistic and symbiotic stages, fragmentary structures, uncohesive self-states, and autistic positions that have a psychotic nucleus at their origin. But can this line of thinking be sustained today? Or does this speculative theorizing merely perpetuate its own psychomythology? With current findings from infant observation research favoring attachment theory, the proposition of normative psychotic processes are largely drawn into question, hence attributing psychotic phenomenon to attachment dysfunction, disruptions in internalization, structural disfiguration of a cohesive self, and early developmental trauma or abuse fueling disturbed self-representations, faulty object choice, and maladaptive interpersonal relationships. That is, when psychotic processes are later detected in people, this would be correlated to the biologic progressive interactions produced by the attachment system, or the infant-mother dyad, and would apply to abnormal populations rather than observed or ascribed to normal developmental sequelae. In other words, insecure, dysfunctional, and disorganized attachments can condition or lead to psychosis, not that it is innate to begin with. This conclusion further challenges modern psychiatry and neuroscience with its emphasis on biological, chemical, and genetic essentialism as the culprit behind the etiology of psychosis. Here, neurobiology or genetic determinism, undergirding psychosis theory, must seriously contend with how attachment and cultural processes affect the development of psychotic organizations that are recalcitrant to materially reductive and simplistic models that prejudicially and politically drive the education, training, and economies of psychiatry today. But let us return to the question of whether there is any plausibility in proposing a psychotic normativity that lies at the heart of psychic organization for all people, universally. Is psychoanalysis guilty of committing a genetic fallacy when positing a psychotic core? That is, can the presence of any psychotic process, for example, disordered thoughts that defy objective reality, ego-dystonic fantasies, delusions, hallucinations, and so forth, be traced to earlier psychological configurations that comprise the ontogeny of the self within a psychosocial matrix that forms the building blocks of psychic reality. Despite advances in infant observation research, the bottom line is that we can never know what an infant truly is thinking or experiencing internally. Epistemologically, we are exempt from ever knowing. Here we may say that the question becomes hopelessly moot because it eludes direct empirical inspection, as all we can do is infer from observation and offer retroactive interpretations that conjecture to explain what we think is going on inside a baby's head within its current environment. Whatever explanatory models we offer are ultimately speculative, even if based on inductive and abductive arguments, which are largely devised to pragmatically help us deal with theoretical conundrums and guide clinical praxis. This is why I argue that any psychoanalytic model of infantile development entails an explanans grafted onto an epistemologically foreclosed explanandum that is pro-offered to help us neutralize our ambiguity when encountering psychological phenomenon not open to extrospection, by virtue of the fact that it may only be known through first-person experience. From attachment researchers focusing on representational models, affect regulation, and mentalization functions operative in the development of the self, to contemporary Kleinians hypothesizing about the primitive anxieties and fantasies that beset the infant in the first months of life, our diverse theories allow us to navigate the turbid waters of uncertainty any science or humanities wishes to mitigate. We may reframe the question of the normativity of the normative universality of psychotic process as a logical posit. I have argued that the mind is dialectical from its inception, and a basic dialectical logic of differentiation, modification, and synthetic reintegration accompanies all psychic development in our process of becoming. Here I have relied heavily on Hegel's dialectical logic, but have offered my own amendments and emendations based upon the observance of clinical and cultural regression, the selective process of internalization and retention, and the abolition of any grand metaphysical absolutism that informs the process of sublation. Rather, mind developmentally forges its own internal structures based on dialectical oppositions, differences, complementarities, and unifying principles that both expand and elevate its internal structure, but with the stipulation that the structural machinations of negation and conflict ensure that individual and collective life will always be infused with pathos. What this means is that it is possible for mind to slip back to previous primitive forms, pressured by fragmentary, unmediated, irreconcilable divisions or fissures in the psyche that are inchoate and equiprimordial, what may not be inappropriately called psychotic in nature, regardless of a person's capacity for healthy functioning. If psychic life is conditioned on a primal polarity that vacillates in, between, and through negation, opposition, and difference, then a basic splitting or rupture lies at the crux of mental functioning. In fact, we may say that splitting lies in the very act of thinking itself, for mind institutes division and separation in any cognitive operation by apprehending, breaking up, and mediating objects. This is central to Hegel's logic as progressive dialectical mediation that at once negates or annuls opposition, while at the same time incorporates or subsumes such opposition through the very act of elevating itself in a new mediated dynamic. In other words, thought generates, confronts, and vanquishes difference as it integrates it within its own psychic reality while transcending its immediate experience in a higher synthetic unity the very process of logical mediation brings about. Sublation is Aufhebung is Hegel's term used to describe the dialectic that at once cancels, preserves, and elevates opposition within a higher developmental achievement the mind actively constructs. This complex process transpires in the rudimentary operations of thinking and cognition as mind generates various divisions and chasms by its entry into antithesis. It is compelled to shore up and reintegrate back into its internal structure. It is in the act of radical negation or splitting where mind first institutes itself as thought. Here we may see the seed of an inherent pathology. Cleaving, dividing, chopping up objects in thought opens us to our inherent emptiness and incompleteness, the very nature of desire as being in relation to lack. Mind is always in a divide, hovering in and out, over and through its separations or gaps in being. How would this process appear as psychosis? And more specifically, how would this appear to the psychotic? Following Hegel's lead, psychosis would appear as the inability to sublate or mediate objects in thought. This would at the very least imply a failure to adequately synthesize or unify representational objects of self, other, and world into a rational or meaningful structure. I further suggest that such a failure at dialectical integration would involve an attenuation or even a possible foreclosure of sentient affective mediation and the obstruction of semiotic linkages necessary for furthering the representational process of sublation. Put tersely, the psychotic lives in the gap. Here there is no mediated synthesis, no integration of imago, emotion, and meaning, only fragmented and fragmentary experience. In Hegel's language, the psychotic is confined to being in itself rather than being for itself, hence relegated to one-sidedness and schism. But as Hegel continues to tell us, and I quote, "This stage of schism must itself be sublated in turn, and mind must return through its own agency to union with itself. This resulting union is a spiritual one, and the guiding principle of that return lies in thinking itself. It is thinking that both inflicts the wound and heals it again." So, what this means here is that Hegel intimates how thought produces both psychic pain and healing, which is not only therapeutic but spiritual. Spirit or mind, in German Geist, is Hegel's term for the psyche at the zenith of its development, which is dependent upon the dialectical progression of the unconscious soul encased in immaturity and early developmental conflict. Following Hegel's logic of the dialectic, the general mechanism behind therapeutic action lies in the increased ability to achieve sublation at various levels of mental representation, from the life of embodied desire to the feeling soul and rational cognition. But this is a continual process that is never static or complete, for the dialectic is always engaged in an active process of encountering new experiences. It must continually mediate and integrate into its psychic interior, without which the dialectic, hence mind, would cease to exist. We are never unified in our psyche, never fully cohesive or complete in our being. For mental life is a meandering stream of entering in and out of a more fundamental fracturing of psychic reality that transpires within spacings of the unconscious. We may venture that such a primal space or tearing of the psyche radically resists other holistic processes fighting to achieve synthetic integration and unification of opposites, because psychic life is organized on sublevels of subjectivity that tend to compartmentalize and preserve idiosyncrasies and particularized experiences, hence constituting its own internal worlds, its safeguards through unconscious fantasy systems. I have referred to this ontological process as the institution and emergence of unconscious schemata, the building blocks of psychic reality. But there is no absolute discernible locus or point of synthesis for the plurality of unconscious life. This ensures, at least logically, that we all experience fractal gaps in being. And the persistence and repetition of such psychic gaps that are presumed to exist and manifest in us all suggest that all human beings have a psychotic nucleus or fault line that can be breached or occluded given the right set of contingencies. I propose that behind every personality structure lies a psychotic process, whether hiding dormant or in disquieted abeyance, or percolating benignly under the right stimulus or catalyst arouses it from its unconscious slumber. I do not mean this applies only to clinical populations, but to all people. Any of us are capable of having psychotic experiences under the right strain or circumstances, even if this seems implausible upon first reflection. Following the principle of sufficient reason, every mental object stands in relation to its original psychical process. Therefore, we may conclude that the divisibility of the psyche, including the bifurcation of drives and affect and images and thought, becomes the ontic foundation upon which mind rests. In other words, the psyche is fundamentally split. And out of this antediluvian divide comes its myriad appearances. This primordial bifurcation of psyche is destined to leave a certain element or remainder mired in negation, conflict, and destruction, the very qualitative properties characteristic of psychotic experience. The notion that experiential gaps in being are punctuated by the imaginary register, yet remain foreclosed in the real, is compatible with a basic line of reasoning that situates splitting, primitive projection, paranoia, persecutory and retaliatory aggression, fear of externality or the other, and general schizoid processes within the early formation of the sense of self. I would also argue this compatibility in theoretical models is bolstered by evolutionary psychology, avowing how basic overdetermined dynamics of fear of predation, injury, mistrust, need for attachment and security, and identification with familiar objects and environments in the service of self-stability and survival are instinctively natural and hard to resist. Here this leaves us in the dialectical gap between the fulfillment of drive and desire and the pursuit of transcendence and completeness on the one hand, and the inevitability of failure, dissatisfaction, impasse, and incompleteness on the other, for we can never live up to our own fantasies and ideals, nor fill the lack. Whether this applies to the notion that our self-image is always fractured and imperfect due to human frailty, to our deep pervasive needs and unconscious longings that pine for satisfaction, Psychic reality constitutes a series of spacings that are never whole or unified, for mind is always in turbulent flux as being and becoming. In my book, Origins, on the genesis of psychic reality, I demonstrated how the dialectic of desire forges the progressive path of ego development that emanates from the unconscious abyss of indeterminate immediacy to determinate mediacy of the unconscious ego to that of conscious life. Thus, the unconscious mind is an original, undifferentiated unity that emerges from its immediate self-enclosed universality to its mediated, determinate singularity. This is initiated through a dialectical process of internal division, self-externalization, and introjection as the reincorporation of its projected qualities back into its interior. Here lies the basic process of projective identification. Unconscious agency splits off certain aspects of its interior, externalizes itself, and then reconstitutes itself by identifying with its own negated qualities, which it regathers and assimilates back into its unconscious framework. Through the complexities of mediation and sublation, the psyche achieves higher levels of unification and integration through rational self-reflection and the attainment of self-consciousness, thus uniting more infantile experiences and earlier movements within its more mature organization. But negativity, aggressivity, and conflict, the hallmarks of death, are essential forces in the thrust of the dialectic, a process that Melanie Klein emphasizes in her characterization of ego development. The initial forms of the mind inhabit an undifferentiated void with the inner ambience of violence. It experiences the primeval chaos of an intense longing to fill its empty simplicity, desire being its form and content, the desire to fill the lack. Through the drive towards self-differentiation, the unconscious ego defines itself as a determinate being for self, and thus affects the passage from the universal to the particular, from a unity that lacks difference to differentiated plurality within singularity. There is an antediluvian cycle of negativity that we say belongs to the prehistory of the conscious subject, a circular motion of the drives that constitutes the dialectic of desire. Awakening is sensation from its nocturnal slumber. The feeling soul remains the birthplace of what is the substance of the heart, for the unconscious abyss is the midwife of mind. Klein's theory of splitting has revolutionized the way we understand ego development. For Klein, the ego exists at birth, meaning the ik, the I, the sense of self, and is plagued by anxieties characteristic of psychosis, which it attempts to fend off and control through the primary defense mechanisms of splitting, projection, and introjection, thus giving rise to the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions that mold object relations and psychic structure. Although Klein refers to these defensive maneuvers as mechanisms, they are not mechanistic. Ego activity is never fixed or static and does not take the form of predetermined tropisms. Rather, psychic organization is the continuity of subjective, temporal processes distributed through spacings of the abyss. It is more accurate to conceptualize these early mechanisms as defensive process systems comprised by the ego's intrapsychic relation to itself and its object environment, initially the mother/other, meaning mother is a small m with the large O in the middle. This is meant to symbolize or represent the separation yet integration of the mother and the other. This makes ego development and object relations an intersubjective enterprise. In her seminal essay, Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, Klein proclaims splitting as the original primordial defense, a process she started analyzing as early as 1929. Beset by the death drive, Todestrieb, the immature ego deflects the destructive principle by turning it against the object, accompanied by oral sadistic attacks on the mother's body, thus giving rise to persecutory anxiety. Splitting is the very first in a series of defenses that are never completely separate from one another, hence forming the dialectical cycle we have come to label projective identification. While Klein cogently articulates the gradual evolution and strengthening of the ego, she concedes that, quote, so far we know nothing about the structure of the early ego, end quote. Not only must we situate splitting at the inception of psychic development, but we must also demonstrate that splitting is the earliest activity of mind. Splitting becomes the prototype of mental process and remains a fundamental operation in the normative as well as in the pathological functions of the psyche. The unconscious ego first undergoes an internal division or separation of its interior, which it projects as an external object within its own interiority, only to regather and again make it part of its inner constitution. This primary splitting activity is architectonic, thus forming a foundation for psychic growth. Since splitting is identified as the initial movement of the dialectic, thus affecting its transition into mediatory relations, it becomes easy to see how splitting becomes the archetype of later ego activity, which Klein emphasizes in her developmental framework. But unlike Klein, who repeatedly tells us that the ego's first object is the mother's breast, it would follow that the ego's first object is itself, its own internality. The ego must first posit and set itself over its initial immediacy, which it does through splitting. In its ego explicitness, for the soul makes its final trajectory to consciousness, unconscious mind has already undergone a manifold splitting of its interior by its own hands. In each incremental process of splitting that accompanies sublation, there is internal division, projection, and re-introjection of its particularization back into itself. Each introjective maneuver is a reincorporation of its projected interior that takes place through an identification with its alienated shapes, which it takes to be exterior object, however possessing its own internal qualities. But why would the unconscious ego need to split itself in the first place? Here enters the force and primacy of denial, or negation. As previously mentioned, the ego's original activity is one of negation. It defines itself in opposition to what it is not. Following Freud, Klein speculates that splitting mechanisms arise in an effort to subvert the death drive that threatens the ego with internal destruction. Splitting is a defense against felt or perceived annihilation. As I've argued, unconscious subjectivity first encounters an inner negativity, aggressivity, or conflict, which becomes the impetus for dialectical intervention. In fact, splitting itself is a violent cleaving operation that divides subject from object. For Klein, splitting disperses the destructive impulse, while for Hegel splitting is destructive. It destroys as it negates. But the destruction incurred by the canceling function of the dialectic is also preserved in the same moment as the ego sublates itself to a higher state. Splitting and projection highlight the negative side of the dialectic, while introjection serves a synthetic function. The repetitive process of projective identification may be applied to the general ascending thrust of sublation, or it may succumb to contentious dichotomies that are mired in chaos. Although the relationship between the death impulse and negation still remains equivocal, destruction is nevertheless a key element in the progressive unification of the ego. But if the subjective mind is not able to developmentally progress towards synthetic rational integration, then earlier primitive defensive constellations will persist unabated. Is there a basic fault line that may be breached under relatively normal conditions, let alone times of inner tumult or external crisis, that may trigger the emergence of a psychotic process? Rather than view this ontostructural a priori potentiality as a reified core or reducible center of subjectivity, I prefer to view this fault line as an elementary or equiprimordial unconscious organizing principle, responsible for instituting internal division in the soul as a mode of psychic economy. Rather than view the psyche as psychotic at its core or foundation, itself a dubious value judgment, I merely want to highlight the double character of the dialectic, inherent in both health and illness. Bifurcations, binaries, poles, and separations allow for the coexistence of difference despite their dialectical relations. And this reiteration of a simple economy allows for psychic differentiation threatened by diffusion or dissolution into an engulfing collective that vitiates all semblances of difference. Here a certain fear of engulfment and loss of self in the universal makes sure that difference is maintained through such divisions or gaps in being. This means that splitting is a necessary ontic condition of thought and psychic structure, and not merely a pathological instantiation or defense. Given that every human being is preceded by a psychological attachment system, whether secure, healthy, faulty, deficient, or morbid, this means that personality formation first encounters splitting and division that is correlated to later psychotic experience. We may only observe how it appears, predicated on developmental precursors. When splitting unearths a more fragmentary or traumatic process, it is more likely to manifest on a spectrum of psychotic organization and symptomatology, which I have witnessed in my own clinical practice. That is, psychosis rarely appears in the same manner in people, despite the fact that we have good reason to believe a typology of psychotic symptoms and disorders are valid for diagnostic categories and or social descriptions. Although negation, itself a form of violence, is the ontological force behind the splitting or cleavage of mind, which is furthermore a generic condition of thought, the unconscious operation of splitting objects remains its universal, hence abstract, form. It is only when particularized developmental, historical, and cultural contingencies are evoked that form carries forth tangible content that becomes intelligible to clinical sensitivities. What becomes an important empirical question that potentially affects the clinical treatment of the psychotic is whether we should proceed with the hypothesis that some form of attachment pathology conditions the emergence of psychosis. This would further presume that some form of developmental trauma lies at the bedrock or essence of symptom manifestation, if not conditions the etiology of disorders of this kind. Although I do not wish to make a broad causal claim or hasty generalization to all psychotic populations, clinical observation alerts me time and again to how early developmental precursors in psychotic patients are correlated with compromises in early object relations and attachment relationships, experiential or perceived trauma, and deficits in psychic structure. In fact, I cannot recall a single psychotic patient in my career who I saw clinically that did not have some variant of these compromises in their developmental history. Because of my own experience, this clinical hypothesis forms a basis in how I conceive of psychosis as indices of traumatic attachment. If we accept the premise that psychosis emerges on a psychic spectrum from more benign or innocuous forms of inner conflict to severely pathological and disabling conditions that undermine the health and adaptation of the human subject, then what role does the dialectic of division and unification, difference and identity, splitting and integration mean for the patient? The dialectic is at the heart of psychic organization, which ensures that conflict remains its structural edifice. In this sense, conflict is at the core of the psyche in both health and pathology. Not only is the failure of dialectical mediation and integration behind the emergence of psychosis, but so is the inability to float in the gap of difference between division and synthesis, which also seems to be a dynamic behind symptomatic manifestations on the psychotic spectrum. The inability to drift in the gap of the gap becomes problematic for those lacking integrative cognitive capacities, especially when this is further blocked on an unconscious level. On one hand, there is a suspension of an integrative function that keeps a psychotic stronghold over the subject, while on the other hand, there is the failure to be able to suspend imagined realities as merely being a psychic projection. In either case, there is an inverse or double dialectic at work in both normative and psychotic thought, one being successful at both mediation and suspension, the other unsuccessful, even if disproportional, at performing either function. If thinking is prefaced on ontological violence, namely radical negation, the cleaving of identicalness, then tearing in the negative is the onus of mental functioning. But here we must differentiate ontological negativity from a phenomenological one. Just because certain self-states at times feel divided, nebulous, or incohesive, does not mean our self is in shambles or falls to pieces. These are usually transitory phenomena at most, while structurally there is an ongoing sense of continuity and cohesion of the self despite its ever-changing dynamisms. Such vital processes are in fact what fortifies psychic structure and allows it to sustain, develop, and endure repeated conflict as a trajectory of dynamic pattern and temporal flux. It is only when the ontological tear in the psyche is incapable of sublating or leaving this divide that psychosis prevails. The primordial split or gap that underlies thought and psychic structure may manifest in myriad fashions, from obsessive compulsive fixations, amorphous confusions, disorientations, disorganizations, fugue states, merger fantasies, thought disorder, bodily somatic conversions like trichotillomania, anorexia, body dysmorphic disorder, circumscribed delusions, and so on, that characterize schizoid, dissociative, and borderline phenomena, to full-blown, chaotic, and demented presentations where all semblance of cognitive order is inconceivably expressed as irreal, meaningless nonsense, incoherent irrationality, and psychic decay, where no persisting cohesive self exists. Instead, any sense of self resides in the divide, fractured, maimed, irreconcilable. What does this mean for clinical theory? Perhaps not very much. But if the psychotic is besieged by the inability to mediate and synthesize dialectical polarity, or reside in the ontic gap of self-relation with all its ambiguities and challenges to both identity and difference, integration and diffusion, universality and singularity, then would not one goal of treatment be to help the patient tolerate such ambiguities so they can stand in the spaces, so to speak? Would not further treatment goals be to help the patient form social and semiotic links to help bind the irreconcilable divisions in his gaps in being? Regardless if psychosis or the capacity for its experiential manifestation is derived from normal or pathological development, patients suffering from psychotic states would still require a holding environment sensitive to their emotional fragility and ambivalent attachment needs. You can never underestimate how fragile a person can be, let alone what might set him off or lead to decompensation, or what may be the link that is broken that's sustaining his sanity, or the internal regulator that is eclipsed from rational decision-making when under the requiem of madness. As we have said, psychosis is the failure of sublation, at least in part, which means a failure at sublation on the part of the ego, as well as fixation or oscillating between fixed presentations and regressive withdrawal back to primitive shapes of mind that were once sublated. It is also a failure of being able to tolerate living in the gap of division, ambiguity, and fragmentary experience. That is, residing in the divide between irreconcilable oppositions. This creates a further ontic tension for the subject that is very uncomfortable to endure, because attempts at mediating and integrating conflicting polarities at war with one another seem to be an impossible task. Here we may observe in the psychotic a basic defect or eclipse of a unifying principle or synthetic function necessary for trussing, transcending, and resolving intrapsychic fissures. The inability to sublate opposition into a meaningful integration based on attacks on linking and or in the failure to bind psychic division and competing dialectics operated in the mind, and hence resulting in semiotic foreclosures, seems to be a pathogenic element in the formation of psychosis. It would logically follow that introducing intervening cognitive skills at synthesizing and integrating conflicting oppositions would be an overarching goal of treatment. Yet this naturally takes into account working with micro-conflicts a bit at a time, not to mention the assault on reason the psychotic experiences on an ongoing basis. What often happens in the consulting room is that patients get better at discerning conflicting stimuli over time and begin to enter into an inner dialogue where split-off aspects of the self come into communication with other alienated aspects, or part self objects, or micro-agents, And this juxtaposition increases the distinctness of particularity while decreasing its penumbral conflation with totality, which becomes lost in universal obscurity. In other words, units of experience can be identified and analyzed without taking the unit for the whole gestalt of experience. A simpler way of putting it is that the patient is more able to recognize opposites in the mind as discrete experiences rather than as an engulfing totality where all aspects of the self are disoriented or eradicated. So, in conclusion, throughout my clinical career, I have yet to encounter those who are prone to psychotic experiences to be free of developmental suffering and attachment disturbances, even if only minor in scope or intensity. When more pronounced forms of trauma, abuse, or neglect are identified, there is always a correlate to how attachment patterns had developed and are compromised in relation to feelings of safety, emotional security, self-cohesion, the construction of object representations, capacities for affect regulation, and the formation of psychic structure. Here we may say that psychotic symptomatology cannot be separated from attachment pathology and the presence of developmental damage. But the interconnectedness between trauma, attachment, and psychosis is often more salient when symptomatology emerges due to post-traumatic conditions. While I have offered a conceptual argument that the psyche is originally constituted through trauma, and that the future experience of traumatizing events in certain people with deficit self-structures would necessarily evoke earlier, unsymbolized, and complicated overexpressions of unresolved trauma, I can envision the possibility that even the healthiest of people could develop psychotic symptoms regardless of their pre-existing psychic structure. What this ultimately means is that all human beings are predisposed a priori to develop psychotic organizations, regardless of biological disposition or cultural circumstances. It simply becomes a matter of degree in their modes of concealment, containment, and manifestation. In short, we all harbor psychotic tendencies, whether realized or not.